There we go. All right, welcome everyone to an Internet2 webinar with some community colleagues who I'll be introducing in a moment. Today's topic is achieving multi-cloud control and the freedom to innovate. And we're talking about Kion and the relatively new Net Plus Kion program. Quick agenda here. We'll introduce the speakers. I'll give a very brief overview of how we got here. And then Randy's going to say a couple of words about Kion. And then we'll hand it over to Bill from Washington State, and then Mark from Princeton, and then we'll take your questions. So again, if you have questions along the way that can't wait, drop them in the Q&A pod. And otherwise, we can take them verbally towards the end. All right. So I'm Bob Flynn. I'm the program manager for cloud infrastructure and platform services at Internet2, and we're joined by Randy Shore, the VP of delivery and support at Kion, and Bill Bonner from Washington State. I'll let him introduce himself in more detail, and Mark Ratliff from Princeton, same. So Kion, how did we end up talking Kion? So back in the summer of 2021, I put out a survey trying to find out from the community where the gaps were in the tooling to support your use of cloud infrastructure and platforms. And the top three needs listed in the responses were account automation and maintenance, security monitoring and remediation tools, cost tracking management and savings tools. And in that survey, people responded to a number of things, and they also put some suggestions in there. And one of the suggestions that came was Cloud Tamer. Now, it's Cloud Tamer, as we got all ramped up and interested in talking about it, they went off and changed their name in November of that year to Kion. So that's what we, so if you'd heard of Cloud Tamer before, Kion is the new and improved version. So in January of last year, we held a webinar, and this, in my personal experience, this webinar was unique. First of all, we had tremendous turnout. Over 100 people showed up, and Randy gave a great demo. You know, Randy's like, Randy can fill, you give him 30 minutes, he'll fill it 60, 90. He can demo the heck out of this thing, and he's got a higher ed background, so it really helps with the context. But we did manage to reel him in enough to get some questions in there, and we actually had over 30 questions submitted during that webinar, just to give you an idea of the enthusiasm of the response around it. Afterwards, I sent out a follow-up survey to see if there was enough community interest in pursuing a Net Plus program, because that's the way Net Plus programs work. Internet2 doesn't decide what we do Net Plus programs about, it's demand from the community. And there was really an overwhelming response. We held a service evaluation in May, and we had a dozen schools sign up to actively participate in the service evaluation, which is about twice the number that usually participates. You know, usually we get 6, 7 schools. We had 12. So it's fantastic. We'll, in the resources section at the end, we'll have a link to the program wiki, which lists all the schools and the individuals from those schools who were leads on the service evaluation. These are all your peers from the community, some of whom are on the call today. And also the documentation they produced in terms of evaluating the security, identity, the functional use, all of that. So that's all documented by your peers, and it's all there for you to review. And we wrapped it up and released the service in October of last year, middle of the month. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Randy to say a couple of things about Kion more broadly.
Perfect. Thanks, Bob. So as Bob mentioned, Randy Shore here. I run what we call our delivery and support team here at Kion. And so really we're responsible for working with customers, getting them sort of up and running with the platform, from the first time they see it, or my 30, 60, 90-minute demonstrations, as Bob was talking about, all the way through onboarding implementation. Before Kion, actually, I spent 10 years in higher ed IT, most recently at George Washington University in DC as well. And so really excited to be chatting with everybody today, and appreciate everybody taking some time. So for those who may have never heard of Kion before, as Bob mentioned, right, ultimately, those three main areas that came up in that survey happen to be the areas that our platform addresses. So first, we're a software company, or this is a software platform that we're talking about today. And ultimately, when it comes to sort of cloud management or cloud enablement, as we call it, we're really focused on the main three public cloud providers, so AWS, Azure, and Google, across those three main areas: that automation orchestration, financial management, and continuous compliance. And so, ultimately, our goal, as you'll hear today, and working with great universities like Washington State and Princeton here, and many others on the call, is to help you ensure that you've got new accounts being easily provisioned, baselined, aligned to a particular compliance framework, all with the idea of giving sort of native access to the consoles, aligning all of your cloud spend back into sort of your internal university budgets or cost centers, and then making sure that we sort of continuously monitor and align those compliance frameworks across the three clouds. So we'll certainly go into more detail today, but that is at a very high level, sort of what Kion is, and excited for you to hear more about it today. So with that, I will turn it over to Bill from Washington State, and we can talk a little bit about your journey.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for framing that up for me, Randy and Bob. My name is Bill Bonner. I'm the Director of Network and Cloud Engineering at Washington State University, and it's a pleasure to be here and share some of our experiences here at WSU with all of you. I really want to start with what our motivation was here at WSU. And some of that goes back into my own experience here in higher ed and at WSU, where I've spent the last 16 or 17 years working in different facets within the university, working in administrative areas, working in academic areas and colleges and so on, working with faculty, collaborating on grants, building administrative services and so on. So I have a pretty well-rounded view of higher ed in general. And we weren't really chomping at the bit per se to go to cloud. If you were to unwind time a little bit and look back at 5 or 6 years ago, we had a lot of investments in on-premises equipment. Our budgetary models hadn't really been realigned yet to make it easy to spend operating dollars versus capital dollars. And so we really didn't have that impetus until about 5 or 6 years ago to really make a sustained effort to shift our operations into the cloud environment. And that really came about due to the increased regulatory requirements around data and many of the grants, the federal grants that WSU receives, as well as the data sharing agreements that we have with state and federal agencies for research. At the time, I was over in one of our colleges, which happened to contain the economics department, and economists, being economists, they love data and they want to do every analysis you can think of on every data set you can think of. And we had a large volume of data sets and data sharing agreements that were becoming increasingly difficult or impossible to really manage at any sort of scale on-prem. And so we went into a sort of a focus group with our main stakeholders on what outcomes they would need from cloud service. If we could be cloud providers for them or offer cloud as a service to them, what would they need? And so first and foremost, since it was the main impetus and driver for our efforts, was it needed to support work with regulated data. It needed to be able to support a wide variety of regulations. And we needed a way to be able to speak with confidence or have confidence moving into the future that we could build environments to comply with CMMC, NIST 800-171, HIPAA, all these sorts of regulations that are very challenging for us on-prem in our traditional environments. We also need to make sure that our costs could be aligned with how grants work and how our funding models work here at Washington State University. And that included direct costs for cloud expenses needed to be able to be listed and included in the proposals for direct costs and grants. And we needed to be able to provide that flexibility within the cloud environments. We didn't want to become intermediaries or sort of middlemen and middlewomen between the faculty and the technology controls that are driving their research programs. So we needed to be able to provide compliance and broad guardrails, but there had to be that flexibility, that direct access and control of the technology that drives the research for the faculty and for their research programs. And as an aside here, we wanted to avoid resellers for a lot of reasons. I don't have a chance to elaborate much on here, but we'll happily answer any questions. So from that, we targeted AWS as our primary platform. We built all native compliance solutions, and we used virtually every service inside of AWS you might think of, building that out. I won't go into all the details at this point, but we built out these environments as a proof of concept with some initial grants and data sharing contracts that were at risk due to these requirement changes. And then once we were confident that we could scale this up, we updated our sponsored award process to make this a requirement for all regulated data at WSU. And that culminated in a memo from our provost saying that for certain classes of regulated data, almost anything above and beyond FERPA requirements or basic Office of the CIO requirements, that it required that they be built out in these AWS environments. And that's where we introduced cloud consulting and office hours and helping faculty through consulting to quantify costs, write them into their grants as direct costs and so on. All right, next slide, please. Perfect. And so this worked really well initially. We had tremendous success. I remember one day I called up our AVP of research and I asked them how they felt the program was going. We were about a year into it. And they said, well, I have no evidence to say that it's going well, other than I've not received a single complaint from any of our researchers. And he told me that that's pretty much the gold star for these sorts of programs. We changed the process that folks go through for sponsored awards, which is a pretty significant change in a higher ed environment in our own research university, and they hadn't received any complaints. So that was for him, everything was going well. But it also provided challenges, because while we were succeeding in AWS and doing quite well there were very legitimate needs for other cloud providers, for Azure, for Google Compute. And so that became a big challenge for us as we explored ways at which we could try to replicate what we were doing in AWS to other cloud providers. But the amount of effort that it takes just to keep up with a single cloud provider, the pace of changes and iterations and innovation that goes on the cloud, which is one of the big drawing points, you're putting yourself at sort of a catchment of innovation, which is exactly the sort of environment you want to make available for your researchers, also becomes a challenge to keep up with. From an administration, cost management perspective, it was very challenging for us. And as we looked at introducing other cloud providers, it just wasn't going to work. And so that became probably our principal challenge in expanding to sort of a multi-cloud provider for our faculty and our administrative IT folks here at WSU. Next slide, please. So it was only fairly recently, obviously it couldn't have been very far back because of the relative recent implementation of the I2 contract and so on, the Net Plus contract with Internet2 for Kion. So last fall into winter, Kion reached out to me and they gave me a demo of the product. And I've seen many products for managing cloud environments. I've seen and heard many pitches from cloud resellers, cloud compliance tools, pretty much the whole kit and caboodle that you could imagine of the industry. I've seen just about every pitch out there. But what I'd never seen was a tool that would allow me to be really strategic in identifying specific accounts and specific parts of our AWS environment or an Azure environment or a GCP environment to target, manage very specifically, grow incrementally without making large disruptive watershed changes into our environment. And critically, that didn't hamper you within the actual cloud environment itself. So that the capabilities that you choose to introduce through Kion don't preclude you from using those native services, those native capabilities that would disrupt maybe established workflows, could disrupt the way that certain research works in terms of the services available or how they function. Doesn't create a barrier or a lag in the capabilities that you can take advantage of in the cloud. And so that's really what sold me on it, our ability to bring the best of both worlds of native cloud and a management solution that will allow us to strategically go in, as well as make it easier for folks that are not faculty, that are not technical, to be able to go in and have visibility into our cloud environment. You know, anyone who's supported these cloud environments and tried to train other teams on how to use them, it's a huge challenge where you go and try to bring your finance folks into the environment so that they can directly see spend and reports and so on, or bring your security compliance folks into the environment and see just the right aggregation of compliance controls that are relevant to them. That's a big challenge. And that's really what Kion would position us to do. And so we move forward with the procurement of Kion. And we're just in the phases of getting it stood up today. And so far, we've been, very happy with that. At the end of the day, what Kion will allow us to do is to take all of that work that we've done in AWS and replicate it to other environments, without going into too many technical details, to achieve our compliance posture, our reproducibility of our environments, our continuous monitoring platform required the configuration of AWS config, guardrail, IAM analyzer, S3 bucket analyzer, security hub, services I'm not even thinking about, systems manager, there's on and on and on to control and configure IAM permissions, to configure EC2 settings, to disable the abilities to provision unencrypted volumes. The list just goes on and on. And the idea of replicating all of that across every cloud provider that our researchers need to be in, really, it's just a non-starter. We don't have the capacity for it. I'd need to hire 4 other people, basically 2 for each cloud provider. And so Kion allows us to, just like moving to AWS allowed us to offload that undifferentiated heavy lifting of IT and technology. Kion, our hope and what we've seen so far is it's allowing us to remove the undifferentiated heavy lifting of managing these cloud environments. So I'm right at about 10.5 minutes, which is my target time. So at this point, I will yield the time over to Mark, and I look forward to any questions that folks may have for me.
Thanks, Bill. So I'm Mark Ratliff. I'm Director of Cloud Infrastructure Services in the Central IT Organization, Office of Information Technology at Princeton. And this weekend, I'm very excited. I have tickets to see Adrian Belew and Jerry Harrison performing Talking Heads songs from the Remain in Light album. So you'll see that some lyrics from the song Once in a Lifetime made their way into my presentation. So I'm going to give you some background today on the use of cloud at Princeton and how and why we decided to purchase Kion as a management tool. Next slide. So as I said, I'm the Director of Cloud Infrastructure Services. I have a team of 8 staff who are responsible for all of the email infrastructure at Princeton. We're the global administrators for Microsoft 365 and Google Workspace. We provision accounts, cloud accounts in AWS, Azure, and GCP. And we also do software development for network automation. And we guide the adoption of cloud services, infrastructure as code, methodologies, and Agile and DevOps within the OIT organization. Members of my team also work closely with our research computing group and other departments on campus on their use of cloud services. Next slide. So backgrounds, how did we get here? Well, up until recently being a few years ago, cloud adoption at Princeton had been relatively slow, I would say. And I believe that is due in no small part to the fact that we completed construction of a brand new data center in 2011. And that data center houses our world-class research computing infrastructure, as well as our enterprise computing infrastructure. And we've just had little to no pressure really to migrate on-premises resources to the cloud. We didn't have any space issues or resource issues to drive cloud adoption from that perspective. However, some researchers really led the way in making use of cloud providers for services that were just not offered by our on-prem infrastructure. So early on, my team got involved with creating and managing cloud accounts for those researchers and for assigning the credits that the vendors provided to the researchers to use their clouds. And so we built a request form in ServiceNow that university faculty and staff can use to request GCP projects, AWS accounts, and Azure subscriptions. And in that form, we require that the submitter provide a university chart string that can be used to charge costs back to the researcher or to the department if they exceed some threshold. We actually haven't actually formally documented what that threshold is, but it's around $500 per month. So my team manually creates and configures each cloud account upon request from the ServiceNow form, and then maintains a list of accounts and chart strings in a spreadsheet. So when our finance group receives the invoices from the cloud providers at the end of every month, they review them, they look for accounts that have spent over, say, $500, and then they'll either check our spreadsheet or they'll send us an email and ask us questions about who owns this account, what are they doing, and then they'll decide whether or not they're going to charge back. In mid 2021, we were tracking about 100 cloud accounts. And we knew that we would soon need a better way to do this because we wanted to be able to generate more detailed reports of spend across groups within a department, to generate timely reports of charges related to each Princeton chart string across all 3 cloud providers, and to automate that account provisioning process. Next slide. So I think I went a slide too fast, previous slide, either that or I skipped. There we go. There we go. So in the summer of 2021, we began investigating some of the well-known cloud management tools. We were focused primarily on cost reporting capabilities. These tools seemed more focused on cost optimization than on cost accounting and reporting. However, it looked like we'd be able to use them if we use tags and labels as a way to connect resources and costs to our chart strings that we needed to record them against. And we were ready to begin a proof of concept evaluation with one of the management tools. But when I checked with my peers at other universities on their use of those tools, I didn't exactly receive enthusiastic feedback. Then at the Cloud Forum in the fall of 2021, I spoke with Rick Rhodes from Penn State. And I thought it was telling that despite the fact that they had access to one of these management tools, that they had decided to put effort into building their own custom system for collecting spend data and generating the reports that they needed. And that's when I heard other folks talking about CloudTamer, which, as we heard, became Kion, as a solution that might work better. So we decided here at Princeton to delay our proof of concept and look at Kion instead. And we were especially interested in a few features that I think were kind of unique to Kion. And those were the ability to create an organizational structure that reflects how departments and research groups are organized at Princeton, the ability to model research grants as funding sources, the ability to link funding sources and budgets to elements in that organization structure, the ability to automate provisioning and configuration of accounts across all 3 cloud providers to automatically provision those Azure subscriptions, GCP projects, and AWS accounts. And also the ability to install and manage this Kion software in our own cloud environment. So I volunteered to be part of the NetPlus service evaluation team, along with my colleague at Princeton, Becky Goodman, who served on the team to review the service agreement. So my team here at Princeton worked with Kion to install an instance in our AWS environment that we use to test functionality and report our findings back to the service evaluation team. And I have to say that Kion was very helpful and very responsive during that evaluation process. It was great to have their support all along the way. And so when we finished the evaluation and Kion became available, we executed an agreement in December. So where are we today? At the moment, we're primarily focused on cost reporting, as I've mentioned. We have our production instance of Kion up and running, pulling in spend data from AWS, GCP, and Azure. We've imported maybe half of our cloud accounts into Kion so far, and we've been learning how to define funding sources, budgets, labels, and reports in Kion. And we're close to finalizing the design of how we want to use those tools, put them together in Kion to generate the reports and notifications that we need. We'll test that design on groups or service owners in OIT first, and then with a handful of campus partners before considering making Kion accessible more widely to our cloud account owners across campus. And we're also having a look at how we want to use Kion to automate account provisioning. I have to admit, I've been reluctant so far to grant Kion the elevated privileges that it's going to need to do that, to have the ability to provision accounts in all three of our clouds. But I'm beginning to be convinced that the capabilities that Kion will provide us to reduce risk within our cloud environment outweigh the risk of granting Kion that access. Capabilities like cost tracking, compliance checking, the ability to enforce policies through cloud rules, and integration with Princeton's single sign-on system could all be used to significantly reduce risk within our environment. We've already done a fair amount of work with AWS Security Hub and Azure policies to establish security baselines and compliance reporting. I don't necessarily expect Kion to replace those tools, but rather we may end up using them in concert with one another. We'll have to see how that plays out. Next slide. And going forward, what do we hope to do? Well, I'm right now working on a job description using some funding that we have for a term position to hopefully accelerate our implementation of Kion. It does take some effort to get everything set up and configured the way that we'll want. There are a lot of capabilities there, and we'll have to put some effort into making Kion work the way that we want. But what I want going forward from Kion is the ability for managers within OIT to have ready access to cost reporting for the resources that they own. I want to establish security baselines and policies that will prevent misuse of cloud resources, and I think Kion can help us with that across all three cloud providers. And I want to make it easier for our campus partners to get access to the cloud. So that's where we started and where we are now.
All right, thanks, everybody. So we've had a couple of questions in the Q&A pod. I'm going to read the first one and Bill's answer, and then put it to Mark to answer as well. So are you, Washington and Princeton, seeing Kion used for back office or research cloud workloads, processes, or both? And by back office, I assume you means administrative computing for enterprise.
Yeah. I'll answer that question
Yeah,
for
go ahead,
Princeton
Mark.
first. So initially, it's going to be back office. The thing, but quickly, it's not. What we're first interested in doing is getting some management and reporting around our costs, making our finance group's job a little easier, getting better visibility into our costs. But one of the things that I want to do very quickly is use the budgeting mechanism in Kion to define notifications such that when someone spends, when a cloud account owner spends over that threshold, they get a notification, because that's like a risk that I want to eliminate. I want those account owners to know when they're spending more than they expect. So that's one of the first ways in which Kion's going to sort of become visible, I think, to our users. After that, as I mentioned, we'll make it more widely available. We'll give access to the web user interface to managers within OIT, from there to a couple of campus partners, and then we'll see about rolling it out more broadly.
All right, Bill, do you want to take your answer on that one, or you want me to just read what you wrote?
I can give a quick summary that way. We don't need to rehash everything, but yeah. So at WSU, we started with regulated research since that was the main impetus. However, because of COVID, we quickly also looked at converting on-prem computer lab courses into VDI solutions. And that was a net benefit. And even when we went back to in-person instruction, those courses retained the VDI because they enjoyed the flexibility. We saw in most cases that students nearly doubled the amount of time they spent working on the lab materials and with their curriculum when they had the ability to access it anywhere versus having to be physically present. So that was a big win for us. We saw some positives there. We're able to manage the costs so that the majority of those costs could be absorbed or replaced by existing class fees. So that was good. And then we recently moved our PeopleSoft student information system into AWS. And really over the last 3 years, we've moved from almost $0 of sort of centrally managed cloud spend to about $500,000 a year in spend. So we saw a pretty big ramp up, and that's across academics, instruction, research, and administration.
All right, excellent, thank you. And then Brad Millett asks, so Kion allows you to opt in existing accounts as being managed through the platform. That is to say, it does not require everything in all clouds to be managed through Kion. And Bill, you talked about how you guys went in kind of systematically, starting with the research accounts and your central IT accounts. But basically the point is you can be selective about it. I don't know, Randy, do you want to expand on that?
Yep. Yeah. So from as Bill aligned or said there, yeah, absolutely. You don't, you can opt in or out different accounts or subscriptions or projects or resource groups across the three clouds. The whole idea of sort of bringing in all of your existing and baselining them with sort of how far off they are from, you know, the posture that you want to get to is sort of wrangling in the wild west bit. From a technical perspective, essentially, Kion would look at whether it's your Azure tenant, your AWS management account organization, or sort of your Google Cloud folder structure. Essentially from there, we would see all the different project subscriptions, accounts, et cetera. And then you can selectively bring them in, or you could bring all of them in, whichever one that you want. Same thing if you have multiple different AWS organizations, for example, we can operate all of that under one Kion installation.
Excellent. And I know this next question, I think, Mark, you touched on it a little bit, but I'll start with you. Are you automating any processes with Kion yet?
That's not where we're starting, but like I said, we have been focused on establishing security baselines across AWS and Azure. Not long ago, our internal auditors did an audit of a couple of AWS accounts that we have and came back with some really good findings and recommendations. And we've been working on establishing those baselines really focused on Azure first. But you know, once we started getting some of those defined, I sort of turned and looked at AWS and thought, okay, we're going to have to do this over again in AWS. And we did some of that. But what I'm hoping that Kion can help us do, especially with those sort of minimum baseline security configurations, is help us deploy them across all three clouds, sort of in one go. So that's one of the things I want to automate is when we provision a new account, that those security baselines get put in place from the start.
Yeah. And Bill, how about you guys? Are you doing any automation yet?
So we're really still in the ramp up phase. However, we have a significant amount of automation that we used for the provisioning of accounts in AWS, the configuration of them, the continuous monitoring, and so on. And our plan is to transition that automation to use the APIs in Kion, so that rather than having to maintain competencies and code bases for 3 sets of APIs for 3 different cloud providers, we can really focus on the Kion API, do what we need to do there, and be able to sort of ubiquitously apply, you know, the same control sets across those different environments. Again, all using that one API. Yeah. Additionally, it integrates well into our existing ecosystem for IAM and things like that. So it works well with a lot of our traditional tools that we already have for that automation, integration, access management, and so on. So that's.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Randy, when you, I mean, you guys have been working with some schools now and obviously a lot of other customers. Where do you see people starting their automation use of what Kion provides?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things to point out. So first, Kion itself as an application is 100% API driven. So everything that you can do inside of the product, you can also wrap into any sort of workflows. I think where we've seen customers who are even on the line today integrate into the API sort of first and foremost is a lot of the universities that we started talking to over the past year had some sort of a sort of request system, whether it was a Jira or a ServiceNow. I see Maureen actually just asked a question that's very similar, right? And so that intake process of, I need to request a cloud account the same way somebody would request a box file storage or a new mouse or a new laptop or whatever, typically happens in some sort of service catalog. And so since that form is already there, that seems to be the most common area to quote wire to the Kion API first. We do actually have even like a ServiceNow sort of reference architecture that we're willing to share out with folks where they can copy and paste it, and it goes out and makes them a new Kion project and aligns it to their organizational budget using like the cost center table within ServiceNow, provisions a new AWS, Azure, Google account project subscription, et cetera, all of that automatically. So that seems to be the most common area that things are getting plugged in. We're also seeing a lot more adoption now of a couple areas. One is using our API to get all of our security findings and compliance findings out into something like a Splunk, for example, for centralized reporting, as well as beginning to see that on, wow, just lost my train of thought. ServiceNow, compliance, totally another one that I'm blanking on at the moment. I'll come back to that when I remember. But lots of uses on the API already, and we're continuing to sort of build down that path.
All right, excellent. Next question from Josh Thomas. Would Kion assist in a hybrid environment to assess historical cost data collection versus compute workloads? So for example, if we're using Azure Arc with on-prem workloads. In other words, could it be used to help evaluate if the workload is being computed and stored in the right place with the right service? That one's going to you.
Yeah. Actually, that just reminded me of where I blanked. So the other bit that is somewhat related to this, and this is where so I'll finish answering that question, is so as Mark mentioned, Kion is not SaaS, right? We install inside of your cloud account, and therefore not only do you have access to the application, you also have access to the database. And so a lot of people are also using this to tie in the financial data into BI tools like a Tableau or Power BI. And so what triggered that, and to answer this question, was around the financial side. So today, Kion explicitly focuses on the public cloud, right? AWS, Azure, Google. But because that Azure Arc is an Azure service, I do believe that it would actually show up in the Azure billing exports that we use to pull in those cloud financials. And so while today we're not hooking into like VMware or any of that stuff that you may have sort of on the hybrid side, we should be able to do cost reporting on Azure Arc and be able to break down that service for you as well.
Sorry, I'm muted. Peter Munch asks, are you using Kion primarily for cloud cost reporting, management, and compliance? Can you leverage Kion for cloud service provisioning with role-based access control? I'm going to give this one to you too, Randy.
Yep. So I think I'm assuming the question was also geared to how exactly Bill and Mark are using it. But yeah, from our single platform, you can absolutely do cost reporting, cost management, and compliance all in one. You also the identity piece, and so there's this concept inside of Kion called cloud rules. It's where we do all of our automated provisioning, all of our automated baselining of the accounts, and ultimately what that also allows us to do is automatically deploy roles that get tied back to your sort of university identity source, whether that's through SAML or Active Directory or whatever it may be, to allow users to federate natively into AWS, Azure, and Google, all from one place with only the proper sort of roles and restrictions of what they're able to do when they get there. So the identity piece, role-based access control is a very big piece for us. And it essentially is how we do a lot of the preventative side of compliance, right? We make sure that if you need to be compliant with HIPAA, you're not using services that aren't compliant with HIPAA out of the gate. And that obviously helps to make sure that, you know, the detect, report, and remediate side is really minimized.
Yeah, and I'll just say that during the service evaluation, I led the identity group, and Mark and his team were kind enough to come speak to the group about the work they had done before we got there. So Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about how the identity setup went for you and how you guys are using it?
Sure. We configured Kion to use our Shibboleth SAML2 service, a single sign-on service, and configuration was pretty straightforward. We tend to use groups from Active Directory, pass that group membership over to Kion, map those groups essentially to groups or roles in Kion that give those users access to whatever we grant them access to in Kion. I'm actually now thinking about switching that single sign-on from Shibboleth to Azure, but I think there may be some advantages for us in Azure, but I saw in a demo recently that, or in a working session with Kion, that they had it integrated with Azure. So I'm going to talk with them about that.
Yeah, we did get those various things documented in the reports coming out of the service evaluation. So SHIB and Azure both, and hats off to Randy's team because they helped build out the Shibboleth documentation, which was not there before, with the assistance of guys from Indiana and Carnegie Mellon. So Bill, you also mentioned just when you were talking about kind of the overall setup that you've got it integrated on the identity side as well. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, just very briefly, you know, one of our wins here was the ability to integrate it into our Okta environment to help extend out that single sign-on experience for folks, you know, and for our faculty and researchers. And so that's really how, you know, that's, you know, really just the summary of it, you know, and again, the role-based access, the ability for folks to federate and see exactly what they have access to, you know, potentially across a variety of AWS accounts and environments. That's really the big win for us. Help manage that credential sprawl.
Excellent. Next question is also for you, Bill, and it's from anonymous attendee who I'm glad to see here. Shows up at a lot of my meetings. It says, Bill. Oops.
Sorry, I moved on you.
You just popped it away from me. Let's see, Bill, and I see you typed an answer, but we'll give you a chance to do it live here. Bill, in regards to regulated research, has Kion made it easier to meet compliance requirements such as CMMC and NIST 800-171? Do you provision separate VPCs for each research account, or just utilize the AWS security tools to meet those requirements?
Yeah, so it could be a very long answer, which is partly why I wanted to put in partly typed answer, partly verbalized. The answer is yes, it'll make it easier for us to manage our compliance requirements, in large part because right now, using native services, native tools, we're able to see compliance with different control sets on an account by account basis, but that becomes cumbersome to aggregate up to a level that is of value for both our compliance teams and other interested parties. And that's true also on the financial side of things. So Kion will help us create reports that look beyond a single account, but across all the accounts that have requirements for a specific control set, and see where we sit as an institution for those controls, and look for commonalities and so on. So that's a short answer to what could be a very long question. And then no, we didn't create separate VPCs. We create individual accounts for each each research program or data source so that we don't potentially commingle data inadvertently from different sources, different agencies, different grants.
Excellent. Maureen, your question's still in there, but I think we probably got that before. I will pull one. Or Randy, you want to go ahead and touch on that?
I was just gonna say, yeah, just one additional thing. So yeah, I think I answered the ServiceNow part of it in terms of what's possible. There is, I'd say, I wouldn't call it a ticketing system. There is a lightweight request and approval process within Kion as well. So if you didn't want to go all the way to a ServiceNow or a Jira or whatever, and somebody just needed a new account, there is that sort of request workflow where somebody can actually come in, tell you, what kind of account they need, what their budget is, where they're going to fund it, et cetera, and have different levels of permission to request. And then you can have sort of an approval process that will actually programmatic, like create everything that you need as well. So that is baked in, but a lot of folks will have something more complicated and want to move into something like a ServiceNow.
Excellent. The next question, near and dear to my heart. I'm going to give it to Mark first. So given the multi-platform nature of Kion, have you found Kion functionality being limited to the least common denominator of the major CSPs for given features, services, resources, et cetera? Mark?
I can't think of anything from the work that we've done around billing so far, but we haven't gotten into deep detail yet. I know that when we had some conversations about the compliance tools, as I mentioned, we've done quite a bit of work with Azure Policy, with enforcement, with Azure Policy, and it looked like there were some instances where if we wanted to shift some of that into Kion, we were going to have to rely on some webhooks where Kion has the ability to, when you create a cloud rule or an action, you can call out to another service, and there might be some things there where we would have to build some Azure function or something to call to make something happen. There's nothing that I've seen so far that makes me majorly disappointed or disappointed, unexpected sort of limitation. But yeah, it'll have some limitations, but they do provide the webhook ability. And like I said, I think what the things like with those compliance that I mentioned, I think we'll look to deploy sort of our baseline compliance measures using Kion, and then the sort of more might be vendor sort of native or more specific or situation specific kinds of rules that we want in place. We might turn to cloud native tools in those cases.
Bill, what's your experience been?
So far, no, I haven't found it to be limiting or having that least common denominator aspect of sort of a cloud management environment. But I think it's also important to understand specifically what Kion does. And this is where Randy or someone else can kick me under the table if I misspeak here, because they're the better experts on it than I am, having really only been involved with Kion for a handful of months here. But really what Kion helps you do is manage the wrapper around the cloud, that account management. And so if you're thinking of getting a tool so that you can deploy a container cluster with a push of a button across every cloud, I don't believe that's what Kion is trying to do. And that's where it becomes so challenging, is that direct resource provisioning, management, orchestration across multiple clouds. And that's where you start to feel constrained in your ability to leverage capabilities within a cloud when you try to use an orchestration tool like that spans the different public clouds. So if you are in AWS, which is what I'll speak to here, and you are running containerized workloads using ECS, and you're mapping those things to EFS volumes for persistent storage, and you are using application load balancers and the dynamic scaling and all of that, Kion's not going to give you a button to say, okay, now go do that in Azure and GCP. What Kion will do is give you the ability to provide consistent controls and reporting around the finances, around security and compliance, around role-based access. So you may have a research program that has a budget and spend threshold and compliance requirements, and they may span the cloud. They may have an Azure subscription, they may have a GCP, they may have an AWS account, and they're doing different workloads in all of those. Maybe there's different services that are idiosyncratic or have differential value propositions to them in those different services. And they can do all of that work in those 3 accounts. They can log in once through Kion, through your single sign-on provider. They can jump into each one of those as they need to. They can see their spend rate across all those 3 environments, and they can apply, say, NIST 800 to 171 controls with compliance reports across all those 3 environments. That's why I got Kion. That's why I bought it. That's why I saw it, I demoed it, looked at it, and signed a 3-year agreement for it, because that alone is worth it. And I don't personally need anything that does more than that, because then I start to feel constrained and have those limitations come in. So if that is what you're looking for to get help with, that undifferentiated heavy lift of the account management, that's where I would pitch Kion.
I couldn't have said that better myself.
I will give one example that I'm aware of, and that is, so one thing that hasn't really come up in the conversation is, and Randy mentioned it, and I think Mark as well, that it's not SaaS, that it is an application that you install in your environment. Well, you can install it in AWS, or you can install it in Azure, or you can install it in GCP. And the one thing that I've seen as a differentiator is they have a quick installer for AWS, but they don't for the other 2 platforms yet. So you can be up and running faster. But as in terms of functionality, I haven't seen it.
Yeah. I mean, I think just to add on to Bill's point, ultimately that sort of push button, get this EFS cluster and blah, blah, blah thing is sort of what's typically described as a cloud broker. And while that has a lot of advantages, in sort of the early bit there that you click a button and you get that, it puts a lot of the onus on resolving that back into IT, right? You have to keep those configurations, up to date, and ultimately, when somebody wants to differentiate from what you have, that's where a lot of that problem comes in. And so, yeah, to Bill's point, we sort of try to give you that cloud landing zone, if you will, that's ready to go and fully compliant here. So thanks for outlining that. So.
Yeah, great. Okay, we have no open questions right now. If anybody just wants to, rather than type one up, wants to speak their question, just raise your hand and I'll give you the microphone. All right, seeing none, hearing none. I do want to point out the slide that's up right now that has a list of the resources available to you. And we can get all the documentation to you with an email to net+internet2.edu. Connect you with the Kion team. I just talked to another school yesterday that had just come out of a Kion demo and was excited and wanted to talk to some of their peers that are using it. So that's another thing. If you want to ask when you write either to net+internet2.edu, or you can write to me, and I'll put my email address in the line here in a moment. I'm happy to set up peer calls so you can talk to other schools that are using Kion without the vendor in the room. All due respect, Mr. Shore. And just have this kind of candid conversation with other schools that have taken a deep look at this. Do any of the panelists have any final comments you'd like to make?
It was a pleasure to be here and answer folks' questions. Don't be shy. I'm always happy to talk to folks from higher ed. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah, and for my part, I'm happy to be a contact. But I also wanted to express appreciation for the Net Plus program and the process that we went through in evaluating Kion. It was great to sort of form a community through that process of folks that I can ask questions of, that we can sort of share what our experience and what our experiences are, and hopefully put together an advisory group that we can use to communicate with Kion.
Yeah, I
Yes.
was just gonna say, I appreciate being here, and to Mark's point, I am very much looking forward to sort of the advisory group. A lot of what we try to put out are accelerators to help, with best practices or make things sort of easier, especially in higher ed, where A, everyone's willing to share, and B, a lot of the problems are very similar across institutions. So I'm personally excited to work on that. As I mentioned, I love the higher ed space where I came from, and so I'm always excited to work with you all. So thank you.
And we do appreciate your time and expertise, Randy, and Bill and Mark as well. So thanks, everyone. We'll give you back a couple of minutes of your day. And to everyone who registered for the workshop, I'll send you an email with the link to the recording and the slides, and we'll make it all available to you. So have a great day.
Thank you.